One of the things about doing the kind of jobs I do is from time to time I get invited to the sort of seminars which increasingly business hold, mainly in elegant English country house hotels, where they spend a weekend away from the preoccupations of their ordinary business to try and think about their strategy. They have a strategy weekend of some kind or another. I'd like to start by telling you about a couple of these occasions which I've been to recently. One of them was very much in this country house kind of hotel style. It was an old Elizabethan manor house that had been converted to have these kind of conferences. And we were meeting in a sort of large panelled room with a great antique table in the middle of the room and some appalling Hong Kong painted reproduction antique paintings on the walls. And across the table there were, on the one hand, the chief executive of one of the company's main operating businesses, and on the other side, the planning manager for the company. And what was fascinating about that discussion was after a few minutes of it, the chief executive of the operating business suddenly lost his temper. And he said, "Look, I and my colleagues have spent probably 5 man-years in the last year preparing data, putting documents into your corporate plan. It's been on my shelf for the year, and I can't think of one occasion on which I've actually referred to it." At the same time, the guy on the other side of the table was a very different kind of character. This was a sort of bluff northerner, but or rather the chief executive was a bluff northerner, but I wouldn't dare to try and do his sort of accent for you this evening. The guy on the other side of the table was an equal caricature, sort of bespectacled Harvard Business School MBA type. He was planning manager, and he got equally angry at this, and he shouted out, "Look, we are now running a business that has 20,000 people in it. You used to be able to run this kind of business by the seat of your pants, but you can't go on doing it." Now, as they later acknowledged in the bar, they were actually both right. On the one hand, the guy who's running the operating business from day to day actually needed some strategic framework within which he could think about the day-to-day tactical problems that were facing his business. So that in that sense, what the planning manager was saying to him was dead right. On the other, he wasn't getting what he needed from the planning manager on the other side of the table. The corporate plan was not doing for him what he required. Let me tell you about another one of these occasions. This was a company with a rather different style, and the rather different style of the company was reflected in the rather different way they ran their strategy weekend. Their particular weekend was held at a rather modern concrete box style of hotel, the kind that had a room full of audiovisual equipment in which the strategy discussion was being conducted. And it also had a sort of exercise room and a swimming pool down in the basement. And it was made pretty clear in that conference that instead of going to the bar before dinner, people were expected to go down to the exercise room in the basement and work off a bit of sweat. And that style was also reflected in the fact that they'd flown in what they called a facilitator from the United States to moderate their proceedings. You can tell the kind of words, facilitator, moderate proceedings, the way the company was framing its particular business. And this facilitator was sort of walking up and down the platform. Rather, it seemed to me like a doorman at a risque nightclub trying to attract people's attention to what he was doing and what was going on inside. And eventually he said, well, what we've got to do is start by deciding what kind of company we want to be. What sort of company do we want to be, he said. Do we want to be Europe's leading firm in our industry or not? Well, people thought about that for a moment. Then he said, let's take a vote on it. Shall we vote on whether we want to be Europe's leading company in our industry or not? You can probably guess which way the vote actually went. So they decided they wanted to be Europe's leading firm in their industry. But then they started discussing some of the implications of that, and quite quickly they came up against one or two practical snags. For a start, in order to be Europe's leading firm in their industry, it was agreed they needed to have some sort of fairly substantial presence in Germany, in the German market. Now, actually, that particular firm had tried to get into Germany a couple of times, not very successfully, and its German market share was less than 2%. What sort of share do we need in order to be Europe's leading firm in our industry? What sort of share of the German market do we require? Well, they quickly agreed they couldn't be Europe's leading firm with less than 15% of the German market. So they had to get to 15% of the German market. So that took them to looking at German acquisitions, because that was the only way to get to 15%. There were only 2 companies in Germany that were big enough to meet these particular criteria. And so you can see how within less than half an hour, that company had drifted into deciding it actually needed to make a German acquisition in order to fulfill its strategy. And it had made that decision, and it has actually now acquired one of these German companies. It made that decision without considering at any time what that acquisition would cost, whether it was likely to be profitable, whether there were any interactions between the business they were buying and the business which they originally were. Actually, the acquisition hasn't worked out too badly. They probably haven't lost a lot of money on the deal, but I don't think they've gained a lot either. What my second company was doing was epitomizing what I think became the predominant theme in people's deliberations about strategy in the course of the 1980s. It's what I've come to call wish-driven strategy. It's the sort of approach to strategy in which companies begin by asking themselves, what sort of company do we want to be? And it's the kind of approach to strategy that is encapsulated in mission statements and corporate visions and all the kind of guff which increasingly you will find at the beginning of corporate annual reports. But wish-driven strategy is actually, it seems to me, about as silly as school children asking themselves what they want to be, and they want to be brain surgeons and engine drivers and so on. It's a sensible, well, it's a possible way of dreaming, but it's not actually a sensible way of planning your career. And it has precisely the same kind of implications in the corporate sector. That is, we've seen some companies, many companies indeed, who've wished to be things that they could not possibly be. We've seen, for example, ICL in Britain, or currently Groupe Bull in France, companies which dream of being large, full-service, main-range computer suppliers like IBM. It's a wish which it's not even clear IBM can have anymore. It's certainly a wish which it's not available for a British company or a French company to achieve. Or there are other people who had their dreams and who were actually fated to see their dreams come true. One of the great examples of that is a company like Saatchi & Saatchi. Saatchi's dreamt of being the world's first truly global international advertising business. And the staggering thing about that wish is they actually achieved it. They actually became what they wanted to be. The only trouble was the process of doing it was one that effectively bankrupted the company. Because what they did was to buy advertising agencies all around the world at prices which far exceeded probably their worth to anyone, and certainly their worth to Saatchi & Saatchi, and the whole shaky empire finally collapsed under a mountain of debt and is now being dismantled by precisely the same merchant bankers who derived large fees for putting it together in the first place. So wish-driven strategy is no more way to go about planning a business than it is to go about planning your individual lives. But if wish-driven strategy doesn't achieve much, nor does the earlier kind of framework I've described, the strategic planning that was so fashionable when strategy became in the 1960s, in which people prepared documents, piles and piles of corporate plans, projecting everything about the business for 2, 3, 5, even 10 years ahead, and where these corporate plans simply gathered dust until people blew off the dust in order to revise them in order to make the next year's corporate plan. That's a style of planning which has actually had a bit of revival again in the 1980s, as the discovery of spreadsheets has actually made it very easy for anyone to create corporate plans. So that instead of having piles of books, you have piles of printout. People are equally ignorant about what they actually mean, and people pay equally little attention to what it is they actually contain. Indeed, one of the things that's happened on the opposite side in the 1980s is we've actually learned, as mathematicians have developed chaos theory, to articulate what I think a lot of people had sensed, certainly a lot of economists and strategists had sensed, and certainly what a lot of practical men had always known, which is that you can't sensibly project and forecast 10 years ahead. And the reason we now understand that you can't actually do that is quite small differences in where you start from are actually likely to develop in these kind of systems and structures to huge differences in where you are in 10 years' time, which means that since your information will never be perfect, even making your information steadily better doesn't necessarily take you any closer to having good estimates, good forecasts as to where you're actually going to be. So I think back about these two strategy weekends. I think of my country house weekend, and I think of my weekend in the other modern hotel with the moderator and the facilitator from the US. But in thinking back on these, I think that what has happened is that we as economists have actually let these kind of people down. Because my first company is a company that recognized clearly it had a need for a strategic plan of some kind to identify and amplify its tactical day-to-day decisions. It's a company that had a need, but that's a need which was not being met. And there were a lot of people in my second company as well who knew that they weren't getting what they actually wanted from this particular procedure. When they had the vote on whether they wanted to be Europe's leading company in their industry or not, I'm pleased to say there were quite a few people in the room who were actually looking down at the floor in decent embarrassment at the way the whole proceedings were going. They knew that this wish-driven strategy wasn't delivering for them what they wanted either. And indeed, if there's a piquant twist to the whole story of Saatchi and Saatchi, it is not to listen to business school professors, because the way in which Saatchi and Saatchi's global strategy actually started, it is said, is that Morris Saatchi once read an article in the Harvard Business Review, which was by Theodore Levitt, whom some of you may have encountered, that told him about the way in which the new global markets were going to take over all kinds of businesses. And Saatchi, it is said, was so thrilled by the concepts in this article that he immediately jumped on the plane to Boston to get every detail of the new gospel from the guru himself. So you should be warned about the dangers of listening too closely to business school professors, and I'm sure you won't be doing so throughout the next 3/4 of an hour. So these needs have always existed, the needs of business to do some more long-term planning, to illuminate their long-term decision-making, to see where it was they were actually going. And the subject of strategy arose, I believe, distinct from economics because these needs existed, and what economists didn't actually fulfill them. Indeed, if we go back to the days in which people developed a subject of business strategy, back in the 1960s, and look at the people who founded business strategy, people like Ansoff and Andrews, these strategists were quite explicit about saying that they failed to find in microeconomic theory the kind of things which would illuminate the problems which businessmen were actually trying to solve. And the reason for that is they saw a microeconomic theory, the microeconomic theory probably to which you've been exposed, in which all firms were either the same or in which firms differed from each other, only in really rather trivial ways. And if you look at the slide we have up here, you can see how that kind of economics was actually so. Where that particular table comes from is from the textbook which epitomized, encapsulates what was called the structure, conduct, performance paradigm, which dominated industrial economics in the 1950s, 1960s, through to parts of the 1970s. That comes from Scherer's textbook on the subject, which is probably one of the best books on industrial economics ever written, and which certainly encapsulates the state of what we thought about industrial organization in 1970. And if you look carefully down that particular slide, you will see its basic structure, why it's called structure, conduct, performance, in which the basic conditions of the industry, supply conditions and demand conditions, determine market structure, go on to influence firms' conduct, and that goes on in turn to determine the performance which firms actually make. So that's structure, conduct, performance. But if you look carefully in that slide and ask how one firm in an industry would be differentiated from any other in the industry, the answer to that would be not at all, because we'd start with supply conditions, which would be the same for all these firms. We'd go on to market structure, which would be equally the same for all firms in the industry, and therefore we would expect their conduct and their performance to be essentially the same. In other words, we're dealing with a tradition in economics in which the unit of analysis is the industry, and firms are either all the same, as they are in our models of perfect competition, or they differ from each other only in essentially trivial ways, as they do in most of the models economists have of imperfect competition. That's the economics that people had and dealt with in the 1960s, and it's why people thought it was necessary, because economics couldn't help them, to develop a distinct subject of business strategy to try and answer some of the questions that businessmen were throwing at people who worked in this kind of area. Now, the interesting thing that has happened in the last 2 decades is as the subject of business strategy has developed on the one side, so the content of industrial economics, or industrial organization as we now tend to call it, has developed rather differently on the other. If you ask what have been the important subjects in the theory of industrial organization in the last 10 or 15 years, you would come up with the analysis of things like contracts, incentives, games, teams, information, a variety of headings like that. Now, these are actually subjects that potentially have an enormous amount to say to business. Contracts are things that businessmen are making every day. Incentives are things they have to confront in every decision they make. Building teams is central to the way in which they run their business, and the flow of information is equally important to what it is they do. That's the way in which economics has been developing. But it's been developing these concepts in a very theoretical way, which I say not to disparage the word theoretical, but to emphasize the fact that they haven't been developed in ways that are directly intended to communicate the message which they have to people who actually work in business. So what I believe we need to start doing in economics is to develop the kind of economics that can take the place of a lot of the strategy discussions I was describing and actually start the process of developing this kind of work and this kind of material in ways that actually apply to real practical business problems. And I'm conscious that many of you in this room are here and are taking the courses which you're doing precisely because you hope to learn from economics lessons and messages that will actually be useful when you go on later to take business careers. And I would be surprised if there wasn't a fair proportion of you who haven't so far been disappointed with the ability of the economics which you've actually learned and been taught actually to make these connections particularly effective. What I want to try and do tonight is to start developing some of the ways in which I think that might be done. And I've talked about contracts, incentives, games, teams, information. I can't talk much about any, far less about all of these tonight. But what I want to do tonight is to focus on the particular issues posed in that to do with games and relationships. And there's a particular reason why I want to do that. And that reason is that when I've said to a lot of people in business, some of the things I've been saying to you this evening, I've said that what I'm trying to do is to develop an economics that can relate to real and practical business problems. The reaction which people typically give is to say, but economics is a subject that can't deal effectively with people, and most of the problems we face in running our business are problems that actually have to do with people. What I hope to try and persuade you of tonight is that economics has something to say about these particular kinds of problems as well. Well, let me begin by asking you to think about a sort of game that business has rather frequently faced in the last 10 years. And this is what I'm going to call the joint venture game. Because one of the developments in a lot of strategic thinking across the last decade has been the belief by a great many companies in the West that they can actually achieve a lot of their ends and objectives rather effectively by promoting a variety of joint ventures between them. So that companies have entered into joint ventures in which one firm seeks to cooperate with another in order to achieve results which can be of benefit to both parties. So a typical joint venture might be one in which one firm has a particular technology, another has a distribution network, and they see that by bringing these together, they can get the benefits of both. Now, almost everyone who goes into a joint venture or goes into a joint venture with some doubt about how the other party is actually going to behave. And if you go into a joint venture, you can go, as you go into some kinds of relationships, wholeheartedly. You can give everything you've got to give to the relationship. Or you can go in somewhat tentatively, recognizing that you're not sure how the other party is going to behave, recognizing that there's a cost to you of giving yourself wholeheartedly in any relationship. And that, as you'll all know, is as true in personal relationships as it is in commercial relationships. You can take on a relationship on the basis you cooperate fully. You can take on a relationship on the basis that you hold back, perhaps to see how it goes. Well, almost certainly in that kind of structure, the best outcome for both parties is the one in which they cooperate fully, and each of them is able to get the full benefit of the cooperative relationship. The worst outcome for both parties is probably, well, not the worst outcome, but a much poorer outcome for both parties, is the one in which each of them holds back. Each of them gives less than the most which they might to the relationship. So if cooperate fully by each is good for both, hold back for each is bad for both. And then we have the two other cases where one party holds back and the other party cooperates fully. And if one party holds back and the other cooperates fully, that's the best outcome for the party which holds back. What you would like to get out of these kind of commercial relationships is a situation in which the other party gives all it has to the relationship while one of the parties holds back. Well, what would you do going into that kind of relationship? If you see a structure of payoffs, a structure of benefits, of gains and losses for either party, what would you actually do? Would you cooperate or would you hold back? Why would you do that? Can you explain what a dominant strategy is? Right, does anyone want to cooperate? Is there anyone in the room who thinks they ought to cooperate? Girl in the middle in the green sweater, would you cooperate or would you hold back? That's you. Why? Because if you cooperate, that's the best outcome for both parties. Right? Anyone else want to cooperate? You'd want to cooperate too. Right. What would you do? What would you do if you knew that you were playing with a person in the blue jacket and he was going to cooperate? What choice would you make? Front row at the end. Yeah. You would? Why would you hold back? Right, so you're not sure whether he's really going to do what he said. Suppose you knew for sure he was going to cooperate, what would you do? And what's the best for you if you knew he was going to cooperate? Right, so the best for you if he's going to cooperate is to hold back. And what's the best for you if he's going to hold back? It could be, but actually you'll get something out of it, even if you both hold back. So you're better holding back than withdrawing from the relationship. Okay? Oh, it's clearly not a zero-sum game. I mean, if you look, we've got one that's best for both and one that's bad for both. Right. Best for one and worst for one is, right, best for one and worst for two is super for one and worst for two. Right? So these outcomes are better than the ones in the top left. We'd be better actually to say good for both rather than best for both in top left, right? So what we've seen, I hope, is, as we were told right at the beginning, that that holding back is what we call a dominant strategy. And that means holding back is the best thing to do whatever it is the other party does. Because holding back is better for you if the other party cooperates, and holding back is better for you if the other party chooses to hold back. And that means that whatever you think the other party is going to do, you're going to hold back. And that means, since that's true for both parties, you end up with a hold back option, and you end up in the bad for both scenario. Now you might think, surely both parties realize what's going to happen in this particular game, realize they're going to end up in the bad for both scenario, and say that if that's the case, we'd each do much better to cooperate. Is that what's going to happen? If I give you a lecture about this game and say, wouldn't you all be better off if you'd cooperated, would that mean you cooperated next time? Far back right. You're lost. Right? Does it matter what you think he's going to do next time? Why? Does it? If he cooperates, what do you do? If you know he's going to cooperate next time, what do you do? Right. And if you know he won't cooperate next time, what do you do? You still don't cooperate. So the paradoxical thing about this game is, even once you've understood it, even if once you've appreciated that the outcome is going to be that neither of you cooperate, that is actually what you do in that particular case. And this is a game in which parties are inevitably driven to the outcome, hold back, hold back. And that's what has actually happened in a lot of the joint ventures which people have embarked on in the course of the last decade. And some of you might have seen this kind of structure before, will recognize it as what people have often always called the prisoner's dilemma. There's a complicated story about that, more complicated than I actually want to take you through this evening, about two prisoners who are arrested by the sheriff, put in separate cells, and then they're asked whether they want to confess or not. And the outcome of that particular game is that they both end up confessing, and they both go down to jail for 7 years, whereas if they'd both simply kept their mouths shut, each of them would have gone to jail for only 1 year. I won't go through all the details blow by blow of what they do in that particular case, but those of you who have encountered, or others who are yet to encounter, the prisoner's dilemma will recognize that this joint venture story is one that has precisely the structure of that prisoner's dilemma, and it's one which ends up with the same paradoxical outcome in which each of them achieves a result that is bad for each, even though they would both be better off if they were both able to cooperate with each other. Now, there are two ways in general in which we get out of that so-called prisoner's dilemma. Now, the first one is the one which comes directly from the prisoner's dilemma, and that says, well, actually, keeping your mouth shut or confessing and letting me to go to jail for a long time, holding back while I cooperate, is something that won't actually turn out to be quite as good for you as you think, because I've got some friends who, when I get out of jail, will come round and produce for you an outcome that will be a great deal more unpleasant than having spent the time in jail in the first place. And that means by changing the payoff structure of this game, by making some of the outcomes more pleasant and other ones more unpleasant, you may actually be able to change it to an outcome in which it pays both parties to cooperate. So one way out of it is to change the payoffs from the game. The second way of doing it is to repeat the game. Now, repeating the game isn't as easy a way out of it as it seems, but you can see that if you were able to repeat the game and play the game a large number of times, you might be able to develop some sort of tit-for-tat strategy, for example, in which if you cooperate this time, I will cooperate next time, and so build up a cooperative relationship. And if you ask people how people actually try and tackle that joint venture game in practice, That is actually how they do it. They don't go in right at the beginning saying, we'll either decide immediately to cooperate wholeheartedly or to hold back everything we have. What we'll try and do is to break down the game into a series of stages, and we will offer to cooperate on the first few of these stages. If we're rewarded by cooperation, we will go on cooperating. If the response is to hold back, we will ourselves hold back. So you can see by repeating this game, you can make it take on a more complicated structure, and a more complicated structure in which you may actually be able to derive better outcomes for both parties. Let's change the game and look at a different kind of game, a different kind of management problem that is actually described by this kind of game theory. This is a game which is traditionally called the Battle of the Sexes. And my secretary takes the perfectly justified view that this is a rather sexist game. So she's changed the structure of the way in which it's set up a bit from the way in which you'll usually find it. The story of the Battle of the Sexes is broadly the following. There are two people, him and her, and each of them would like to go out together for the evening. They're sufficiently in love that they would both prefer to be at the same place. They'd like to go to the same place, but he would much prefer to go to the knitting demonstration, and she would much prefer to go and see the sumo wrestling. So as far as she is concerned, the best outcome is one in which they're both together at the sumo wrestling, and the second best outcome is one in which they're both together at the knitting demonstration. The best, a rather inferior outcome for each is the one in which they go separately to the particular venue which they prefer. So that's the outcome in which he goes to the knitting demonstration and she turns up at the sumo wrestling. And of course the worst possible outcome is the one in which he ends up at the sumo wrestling, which he hates, and without her, which disappoints him. And she ends up at the knitting demonstration. She doesn't like knitting, and she isn't there with him either. Now, if you have to decide, and this is the problem of this particular game, again, it's a non-zero-sum game. You'll see that some of in the sense that it's not a game in which one party wins and the other loses. It's a game in which, by coordinating their behavior, they can actually achieve outcomes for each. The question here is, if you have to decide what it is you do, independently, what do you actually do in this particular structure? What would you do? You're him. Third person back on the right. What would you do if you were to make up your mind what to do in this particular occasion? Where are you going to go? You're going to go knitting. That's because you're purely selfish, is it? And you really enjoy knitting. Would all the women in the audience go to the sumo wrestling? Yes? Everyone is going to go to their selfish particular outcome. Well, that's not a bad set of choices to make. He's going to end up at the knitting. She's going to end up at the sumo wrestling. They're certainly better off, and this is a paradoxical thing about this story, they're better off than they would be if they both behaved unselfishly. Because, of course, what would have happened if they behaved unselfishly would that she would have said, well, if he insists, I will go along to the knitting demonstration. And she would equally have said, well, I know what he likes, and I will go along, and I will go along reluctantly to the sumo. So the worst possible outcome is the one in which each of them behave unselfishly. The more likely outcome, perhaps, is the one in which they each behave selfishly. But there are two outcomes that are clearly better for both than either of these, which are the coordinated outcomes in which they both go to the same place together. You can see that if the last problem we looked at was the problem of cooperation, this is a problem of actually achieving coordination. It's a problem in which it doesn't matter what it is you do so much as that you should both do the same thing. It's like the problem of should we all drive on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the road. It doesn't matter a great deal which it is, but it does matter a great deal that we all make the same decision about which it is we do. And you can also see how we go about trying to resolve these problems. You know, the simplest way of resolving a problem like the battle of the sexes is actually to impose some hierarchy on it. So, for example, we always do what she decides, and that means perhaps that we always go to the sumo wrestling, you know, which is slightly unfortunate in some ways, but it's a better outcome than going on each making our independent decisions. Another outcome here, too, is that we see ourselves as going into a repeated game, and if we have repeated trials of this particular game, perhaps we can set up a strategy in which sometimes we go to the sumo, sometimes we go to the knitting, and each party gets a fair amount of what they want out of the relationship. You can see again that we can do things better if we can either change the payoff structure or if we can repeat the game. So let's go on from the battle of the sexes and talk about the third of the games I want to introduce you to tonight, and this is a game that is actually called Chicken. It's a game with a long history from the movies, actually. The reason it's called Chicken is that it dates from a movie by James Dean, which many of you may have seen, called Rebel Without a Cause, in which the two players of the game drive their stolen cars towards a cliff, and the winner is the person who jumps out of the car last. If you've seen the film, you'll know it has a rather unhappy outcome, as these particular games are likely to have. And if you want to see that game being played out in real life, the version of it which I like best is the City of London after Big Bang, in which 28 firms decided to go in for making markets in British government securities. Each of them has been losing money ever since. There is a big prize to be got for the last firm that stays in that particular game, but so far, in the course of staying in it, the total losses to all the parties involved are something like £1 billion, and there are 23 players still in that particular game, 23 people still driving their cars towards that particular cliff. The version of the game we're going to play tonight actually comes from a rather different movie. It's from the movie Stand By Me, and what happens in that particular game is a rather simpler version of the chicken game. The one I've just described to you is actually a very tricky game to analyze. This is a simpler version of the chicken game in which two people drive at each other down the middle of a road. It's a bit like what happens if you haven't resolved your coordination game and decided which side of the road you're going to drive on. But in this, they're doing it for kicks. Two people are driving towards each other in their cars at considerable speed. The way this game is played is it's by the following rules. The person who swerves is obviously chicken. So the way in which you win the game is you are the person who sticks and drives straight on while the other person swerves and lets you by. If you both swerve, then you both look pretty stupid, and that's an unsatisfactory outcome for each of you. But obviously it's not as bad as the other possible outcome, in which you both stick, and then you're not likely to be in the position of treating this as a repeated game. What do you do if you're faced with that kind of game? Who's going to stick? How many of you are going to stick? And swerve? Right. There are a lot of chickens I can see in this particular room. But of course, if you both swerve, then you both end up with this rather stupid swerve-swerve outcome. How many people, having seen that, would actually stick? We know that most people in this room are going to swerve. Does that prompt any of you to think you want to stick? No? Very few brave people in this particular room. So none of you would have gone into that particular gilts market. And of course, if none of you had gone into it, you would have left a fat profit to be made by the one firm that actually decided to do it. Funny thing about chicken is what it actually is in many ways the best solution to the game of chicken is actually sometimes to do one thing and sometimes to do the other. It's one of the paradoxical things about chicken is if you know what the other party is going to do, you know what it is you ought to do as well. So that you want to keep the other, if you can't commit yourself to sticking, and it's not clear how you can commit yourself to sticking, what you want to do is to randomize your behavior. Sometimes you stick, sometimes you swerve. And actually you can show that this kind of structure of game has a sort of mathematical solution in which the best thing for each party to do is sometimes to stick and sometimes to swerve. There's another question which you ought to be thinking in this form of game, which is, can't we change the payoffs in a way that actually makes, can't we change the payoffs in a way that actually makes the outcome of the game better for both parties? What I've been talking about so far are three forms of simple games, each of which has a large series of management implications. Because what we've seen have been three games: the prisoner's dilemma, the battle of the sexes, and the game of chicken, which correspond to three of the classic types of problems that people have to face every day in business. The first is the problem of cooperation. How do you achieve a cooperative outcome in which people's individual incentives are to hold something back and not contribute fully to the joint outcome? Everyone knows in that kind of situation that it will be best for everyone if everyone cooperates, but how do you actually bring that particular outcome about? Second one is the problem of coordination. That is, it matters that we all do the same thing much more than it matters what it is we actually do. And the third one is the problem of discoordination. We have an opportunity which will be disastrous if everyone tries to exploit it, but it will make sense and pay if only one or two people try to exploit it. So that we start with the problem of cooperation, the kind of problem we face every time in a business we're trying to arrange or agree a transfer of information, or in which we need to persuade people to respond quickly and flexibly to the options which they face. We've got a whole set of problems of coordination in which we need to agree procedures or establish some relationship with suppliers. The sort of situation where we need to agree on what we do, and it matters much more that we should agree than it does what it is we actually agree on. And the third is a group of problems which you frequently get in competitive situations, where you have things that it pays one party to do, but it doesn't pay anybody to do if everyone does them. That's the kind of chicken problem. And the outcome can either be disastrous, or it can be one in which no one actually attempts to do what it is that will pay for everyone. Now, we've also seen, I think, that you can generally escape from these particular pathological outcomes, these pathological games in which people are inevitably driven to results that nobody intends, typically in one or other of two ways. One is by changing the payoff structure. So you make some sort of commitments or enforceable agreements with each other that give different returns in different cases to some of the parties involved. So we said in the prisoner's dilemma, if we could actually deter people from not cooperating, then we would make everyone better off. Now, you can't do that in my joint venture game, because you can't make a contract that says, I will cooperate fully. That's not the kind of contract you could make. It's not the kind of contract which courts will enforce. So the only way you can deal with it in the joint venture game is by repeating the game, by putting yourself in a situation where you're playing that particular game over and over again. And it's only by breaking down the problem of cooperation into a repeated game that you can actually avoid driving yourself into the non-cooperative situation. So you resolve these kinds of pathological games either by changing the payoff structure or else by repeating the game. And that brings you to the principal kinds of contracts and relationships that people actually make with each other in business. The commonest form of contract is simply a spot contract in which people exchange one thing for another. But the ways in which they have to deal with these more complicated structures I've described, with these problems of cooperation, coordination, and discoordination, is either by making a classical contract with each other, the kind of legal document in which people change the payoffs and in which they bind each other up in a great deal of red tape, or the sorts of informal contract which you make with each other when you get involved in a repeated game, what's called a relational contract, in which the behavior of each party to the contract or the relationship is governed not by piles of legal documents, but by understandings and rules of the game about which people will behave, which have been established for each other in successive trials of these kind of repeated games, whether they're of prisoner's dilemma, of battle of the sexes, or of chicken. In working through a variety of games of these kinds, people gradually build up relationships with each other in which they achieve cooperative relationships and in which they can achieve coordinated outcomes when they need them and discoordinated outcomes where these are appropriate too. So that if we could skip 2 and go on. Sorry. That one, 3 Tales of Management, at the end. What I'm describing is the ways in which people make contracts, have relationships, in order to try and achieve these outcomes in repeated games. I'd like to end by giving you just 3 examples of ways in which people have put together these sorts of relationships in order to achieve competitive advantage for themselves in a particular market. Let me start with the second one, which is Liverpool Football Club. We've been doing a bit of analysis of the comparative performance of English football teams. And what we've been trying to do in a proper economic style is to look at the performance of particular football clubs relative to their expenditure on players. And we've discovered there's actually a rather strong relationship between the position people get in the league, or the average position over a period of years, and the amount they spend on players in a combination of wages and transfer fees. 2 most successful clubs in English football over the last 20 years have been Liverpool and Manchester United. And Liverpool and Manchester United have had approximately equal quality of players over these 2 decades. And if you ask how I know they've had equivalent quality of players, then the answer is by my objective economic test, which is if you add up the sum of the wages the players have earned to the transfer fees that the clubs have paid for them, netting off, of course, the sums they've earned by selling off some of the players to other people, the total expenditure on players of Liverpool and Manchester United is more or less the same. But over that 20-year period, Liverpool has actually been far more successful on average in league terms than Manchester United has. And indeed, in terms of our overall relationship between expenditure on players and league performance, there are 2 clubs that are way, way off our regression line. One of them is Liverpool. The other one, as a matter of fact, is Nottingham Forest. And that turns out to be a Brian Clough factor that has also defeated our regression, not only for Nottingham Forest, but for the 2 previous clubs that Brian Clough actually managed before he went to Nottingham Forest. But Liverpool is the case I'd like to ask you to concentrate on for the moment. If we ask what it is that goes into Liverpool's particular success, well, we've built what is my simple-minded economist model of the game of football. And my economist model of football says when you get the ball, there are 2 things you can do with it. You can either kick it towards the goal, or you can pass it towards someone who's better placed to kick it towards the goal than you do. And you'll quickly see from that structure that what you will do with the ball depends on what, in turn, you think he is going to do with the ball, and so on. And you can easily show there are 2 types of equilibrium in football. One is the shooting game, in which whoever gets the ball kicks it straight towards the goal and hopes it goes in. And the other is the passing game, in which you pass to someone who's better placed than you are. And both of these are sustainable equilibria in an economic sense. And in our view of this particular story, and in the view of some people who know more about football, if less about economics than I do, broadly speaking, what Liverpool have is a passing game, and what a variety of other clubs have is something that looks a great deal more like a shooting game. You'll see the consequence of that is that Liverpool, as a passing game club, becomes a club in which the aggregate of the team is more than the sum of the values of the individual players, while a shooting game club is one in which the performance of the team is precisely the aggregate of of the individual players. A shooting game club is something like a cricket team, where you just add up all the individual scores and that gets you the team score. A passing game club can actually do better than that. So Liverpool have a passing game. The other thing Liverpool have is organizational knowledge. I don't know how many of you know about the famous books in which the knowledge Liverpool have of every game they've played, of what every pitch was like, and what they learnt from each experience they had on that particular occasion is enshrined. But what Liverpool have done is to create a body of knowledge about football generally and about their performance and role in it, which no other club has anything that quite matches. And Liverpool's superior performance is based, as we see it, on these two things, that passing game and that distinctive organizational knowledge, which mean that the total value of Liverpool Football Club is actually rather more than the sum of the values of the individual players. Now, you'll see that that has a commercial significance, not just in that you score more goals, but that you actually generate a return for the organization as well as a return for the individual players. In other words, Liverpool is worth more than the sum of the parts, and that addition, which is slightly more than the sum of the parts, is something which is the value of that particular club. And you can also see in terms of my styles of contract why it's essential that Liverpool, in order to do that, are engaged in a repeated game, in a very literal sense, in which they're playing, have these types of relational contracts with each other. Because the only reason I'm willing to pay a passing game with you is that I know from experience that you are willing to play a passing game with me, and therefore we've built up this long-term structure of relational contracts. So we've built up that passing game through relationships over a period of time. And the reason we need to do that is you can't effectively run a game of football simply by shouting instructions, pass or shoot to people from the touchline. Football moves too quickly for that to be a possible way of running a football team. You can't run a football team in that kind of hierarchical structure. You rely on people's fast responsiveness, you rely on their judgment, you rely on their ability to communicate information very rapidly to each other, and you can only do that by taking up the structure of repeated informal relationships that I've described. Let's talk about how a real business has actually exploited these kind of advantages. The business I'd like to take there is the Italian knitwear industry. Italian knitwear has been by far the most successful European knitwear industry over the last couple of decades. Now, lots of sectors of European textiles responded to low-cost Far Eastern competition by saying what we need is highly mechanized production systems with lots of output being produced in large quantities in large plants with considerable scale economies. The Italian industry went precisely the opposite way. More than half of all Italian knitwear is produced by firms which employ less than 10 people. And not only are they small firms, they're small firms which are located in a particular location of Italy, in what's called the Carpi area, which is something north of Bologna in Emilia-Romagna. That's one successful sector of the Italian textile industry. There's another successful sector which you will see in the high street under names like Benetton and Stefano, which looks as if it's big businesses like the ones that Courtaulds and some of the German firms and Coates Viella tried to establish. But actually it's not like that, because what Benetton is a firm, sure, a central large firm with a corporate headquarters, but it's a firm which relies on franchisees for most of its outlets, and it's a firm which relies for a high proportion of its production on subcontracting that production to relatively small units located in well-defined areas of Italy. In other words, the way in which that Italian knitwear industry has been successful has been by having highly disaggregated, flexible units that have extremely informal relationships with each other. And the reason that has been a successful way of doing business has been for precisely the same kinds of reasons as it's been a successful way of running Liverpool football team, You've built up long-term, repeated cooperative relationships that enable you to get shared knowledge and fast and flexible responses. And that is what has proved a decisive competitive advantage in running a knitwear industry that has developed from one 25 years ago, in which there was only one kind of sweater you could get, and it was blue and had a V-neck, and that was what people wanted. The one... and some of them were very durable. And have done faithful service to their owners for at least the 25 years. Well, that's what sweaters were 25 years ago. People nowadays wear sort of smart Italian textiles, which are designed to respond quickly to individual fashion trends. And the way in which you can do that, and the only way in which you can do that, is by having production systems that can change, respond, recreate, reform themselves very quickly in different ways. And that's what, with that network of small firms, the Italians have succeeded in doing. We see a lot of that kind of industrial organization in Italy. We see even more of it in Japan. And the last contrast I'd take for you is that between Japanese automobile components and American automobile components. In the component industry for cars, all the firms which are in that kind of business need to have dedicated parts produced for them. Lots of the parts that go into a motor car are designed individually for that particular car. Now, as a small firm, you'll be reluctant to commit yourself to that particular relationship unless you believe you're engaged in some sort of repeated relationship with the primary contractor in that particular business. If we look at the way in which the United States car industry is organized, we find that almost all these highly specialized components are actually produced in-house. It's impossible for American firms to find outside suppliers that are willing to take on the risks of dealing with that kind of contract in an American context, while most of these components in Japan are actually produced by small firms of subcontractors who find it possible and are willing to take on that kind of risk and are willing to do so in a context where they understand they have a relationship with Nissan or Toyota or Honda in which these kind of risks and these kind of balancing of gains and losses are part of the understood rules of the game. And that's, again, they're part of how, by means of flexible responses, the Japanese are able to have much shorter reaction times, much shorter model cycles than American producers have been willing or able to achieve. And that's very much part of a culture in which people have a different kind of contract style to the United States one, in which you will never make a deal without being flanked by your attorneys, to a Japanese one, in which people mostly find no value in taking along their lawyers to make contracts for them. That's why Japan has 2% of the number of lawyers that the United States does for a population that is about half the size. It's a different style of contracting, and it's a different style of contracting that serves various kind of businesses well. So business strategy, then, is not something that's about the kind of elaborate, formal, structured planning that I described at the beginning. It's not about wish-driven strategy either, in which you start by asking, what kind of company do we want to be, and then think through from there how we actually get there from here. Strategy in a real business is actually about how you relate the characteristics of your particular business to the commercial environment with which you face. And what I hope I've talked to you tonight is about some of the ways in which economics can illuminate the process of actually trying to do that.